Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We will wait a few minutes and let everyone join. We'll begin at about a minute past the hour. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to everyone who's joining. We'll get started at about a minute past the hour. We're excited that you're here. Good afternoon, everyone who's joining. We'll start at about a minute past the hour to let everyone get on to the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone who's joining. We'll start at about a minute past the hour. Welcome to everyone who's logging on for maybe your first NASPO webinar. Good afternoon, everyone. We're about to get started, just letting everyone join the webinar. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Smith. I am the Director of Legal Education for NASPO. Welcome to a NASPO webinar brought to you by the Research and Innovation Team and NASPO Legal Education. NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials, is a nonprofit association. We support the chief procurement officers and the staff in their states, territories, and the District of Columbia. NASPO provides education and resources to state central procurement offices, and NASPO Legal Education focuses on educating and creating community for the attorneys in the states who support the central procurement function. Today, we bring you an expert in the field to discuss what is increasingly the technological question of our time. What do we do about artificial intelligence? Author Arthur C. Clarke once said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Well, today we will try to demystify that magic, learn what we can do to educate ourselves, and discuss how our state procurement officials can navigate this increasingly complicated area of acquisition. While I'm introducing our speaker today, please take a second to answer the poll on the screen so we get an idea of who is in our audience today. Our speaker today is Robert Bob Metzger. Bob heads the Washington, D.C. law office of Rogers Joseph O'Donnell and chairs the firm's cybersecurity practice. Bob has been recognized for contributions to federal, state, and local technology contracting. He was among the leaders of the successful efforts to reform IT acquisition in California and Oregon, has spoken on SLED topics previously at forums of NASPO, NASCIO, and the American Bar Association, and has been a guest lecturer at GW Law School on state and local procurement. On the federal side, Bob was a member of the Defense Science Board Task Force on Cyber Supply Chain Security and was a co-author of the 2018 MITRE Deliver Uncompromised report that has influenced DoD and civilian agency security measures, including CMMC. Federal Computer Week in 2016 named Bob a Federal 100 awardee, citing his ability to integrate policy, regulation, and technology. The International Legal Ranking Authority Chambers ranks Bob in Band 1 for government contracts, cybersecurity, USA nationwide. Bob is a vice chair of the Information Security Committee and of the Risk and Trust Committee of the ABA Science and Technology section. He was recently named a top voice by LinkedIn, an invitation-only distinction featuring senior-level experts. After graduation from Georgetown Law, Bob was a research fellow at the Center for Science and International Affairs, now known as the Belfer Center, at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Before we begin today, please note that we won't be taking anyone off of mute due to the registration size. We have a Q&A and a chat function for you to ask questions, and if there's time at the end, we will prompt Bob with some of those questions. This presentation is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be available on the NASPO website and for our members on the NASPO network in the coming days. NASPO is honored to invite Bob to speak to our membership for what I think is the 4th time, and we are very grateful that sharing his expertise is also one of Bob's favorite things to do. So Bob, thank you so much, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say today.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be here. I want to thank everyone who's attended. I'm really impressed with the diversity of states and locations who are checking in by chat. Of course, what that means is that there's also going to be a pretty wide span of what people know, what concerns people, what they worry about. And that, of course, decreases the likelihood that I can actually answer all of your questions in the 1 hour that I have. But I will do my best. So I want to mention first a disclaimer. What you hear will be my views and not the views of any client or anyone else. And I am here representing no one, and I am advocating for nothing. I'm doing this essentially because I think state and local procurement is important, and because I think that artificial intelligence has both great promise and peril for state and local procurement, and I'm hoping to make a bit of a contribution to those of you who have the responsibility to see that it gets done. As you will observe in a moment or two, I've chosen to go path B for the slides. You know, sometimes we'll have slides for a program like this that have a short number of bullets and a small amount of information so that they're not, distracting to the observing audience. That's path A. I have chosen path B. We have a lot of ground to cover. So what I thought I would do is put a lot of information into the slides, discuss some of it only briefly. But my intent is that my hope is that these slides will prove useful to those of you who get them afterwards, and you'll see that they include a fair amount of links to the many sources that are emerging about artificial intelligence and public procurement. I do have to offer one other disclaimer, and that is that this damn thing won't stand still. I did a program in mid-November for the state procurement lawyers part of NASPO. It was a pretty good program, and I think reasonably well received. That seems so then, because so many things have changed in the last just 4 months, and I think this rate of change is something both to something to recognize and accommodate. Sometimes the rate of change like this can cause us to say, I don't want to get anywhere near this problem. It's moving too fast, and where it's going, neither I nor anyone else know. But in this instance, artificial intelligence is upon us. It's likely already being included in some of your vendor products and services. Virtually every state and local government will have some cause or another to think about its utilization. And as one of the comments said, it's moving at an increasing rate of acceleration. So hard or not, knowns or unknowns, we have got to just, not only get smarter, but stay smarter. And with that, let's go off to the next slide, please. So what are we going to talk about? Well, you've all heard endlessly of the duality of AI, and it's all too true. I mean, AI is at once a great challenge for state public procurement, both as to outcomes and process. And it's also a great opportunity because there's an increasing list of uses and outcomes that can be enabled or accomplished through the use of AI that would be difficult to accomplish in some cases without it, or even impossible. And although we all have heard from various vendors the word transformative many, many times, in this instance, once we have appropriate ground rules or guardrails in place, there really is the opportunity for transformative changes, not just in how states deliver services and function for the benefit of citizens, but also how the state workforce gets its job done. But getting from the current case to the future case is not going to be easy, and there's a variety of external and internal barriers that we have to recognize and address. Now, when we hear about AI, we often hear a lot that is hyped up by the hyperscale providers, the Chat GPT, the Open AI, the big hyperscale providers, and we're told about different forms of AI, such as foundation models and generative AI. Let's go back one, and I'll talk about those a little bit. To some extent, these things are merging, but I'll try to make a quick introduction, which I may elaborate upon later. If you're talking about AI that has the ability to predict the weather or to perhaps generate new cancer medicines or to present an existential threat to humanity, or which would be the formation of artificial general intelligence, which most of us worry about, that's foundation models. And those tend to be owned and operated by a handful of hyperscale computing enterprises. But what we will find in the marketplace is that there is an increasing number of providers who will derive some of their technology or information processing assets from the foundation models, or who may create their own on smaller infrastructure. And I still think there's a distinction between generative AI and large language models. Generative AI is the stuff that can do chatbots. It's the stuff that can produce, audio outputs, video, can help you code, and that can be done with little or no human intervention. Large language models, yes, you will get a copy of the presentation. Large language models tend to generate text results and analytic product, and some of the popular large language models are a little bit different than the popular generative AI, but we'll find that some of the generative AI models can do large language tasks, and some of the large language models can do generative AI. The actual risks, whether they be legal, operational, safety, or privacy, essentially depend upon the particular nature of the algorithms being employed, the technology and data processing resources, the stack behind the AI service, and of course the terms and conditions. So what we want to do is to find a way to thread the proverbial needles. And that is, we want to exploit the opportunities for AI to help state government improve the responsiveness of the state, the quality and timeliness of its services, while at the same time navigating around known and presently unknowable hazards as will emerge. Now, we also have to recognize that AI is something that you may be asking for, and also something that you may get without your knowledge unless you ask for it. I was just reading the recent California Gen AI guidelines for public sector procurement use and training. They came out earlier this month, and I make reference to them later rather in the presentation. They make a distinction between AI that is incidental and AI that is intentional. And incidental is where you think you're buying X and Y without AI, but in fact your vendor is using it. And intentional is where the vendor is selling it to you. And you, as persons charged with state responsibilities, really need to know when and where it is, regardless of whether the purchase is incidental or intentional, although the risks that are present and the potential consequences for safety or the rights of persons, they could differ quite a bit. This is not going to be an area where one template fits all. We may need, a single set of policies and core values for states to adopt. We may want a common process or a defined organization across state entities that will work to manage AI. But it's going to be a lot of assessment of risks and opportunities, rules and protective measures for each of the use cases as we come to know them or conduct pilots to assess them. Now, I wanted to mention here that the federal government has embarked upon a very ambitious effort both to exploit AI and mitigate its risks. And I want to focus just on that phrase, exploit and mitigate, because the Biden administration's approach, quite thoughtful but not without controversy, is essentially saying that I'd like to have the cake of being a world leader of AI, and I'd like to have the cake to mitigate the risks of AI and perhaps consume it as well to use it. And these are awfully hard things to reconcile. And I suspect that as you at the state level confront some of the more ambitious opportunities for AI, you will see that there is a cake there, but you will be worried about all the things that might be hidden in that cake or how it could go wrong. And so your actual ability to exploit the great potential of AI likely will prove more difficult for many purposes other than those that are rather carefully tailored. To put it simply, we need more experience on the ground and better policies and procedures at the state level so that we know what we're doing and can be accountable internally as well as transparent and responsible to the public stakeholders as well as state employees who matter a great deal. Now, the Biden administration also issued an AI executive order, which has lots of useful things that have relevant guidance. And the Office of Management and Budget issued a draft guidance. We'll talk about those a little later. Now, interestingly, the European Union very recently adopted its Artificial Intelligence Act. And here again, as in privacy with the GDPR, the EU has gone much faster and much further than has our Congress and our federal government. We have no federal privacy legislation. That's why each of you states have your own. And that seems to be the same direction that we're heading, for better or for ill. States are moving out on their own to take various actions, as we'll discuss, to address AI. It would be perfect if we had a national policy. And we have a lot of good resources there and even some great commentary from this Congress. But there's a big difference between, the sum of all the possibilities that are uncoordinated or not adopted and actually taking measures that are adopted and do have some legal force and effect. And part of the reason that states are able to move faster, as I think all of you know, is that we don't have a fractured Congress and we don't have the separation between the executive branch on the federal side and a divided Congress on the legislative side. In state governments, it's more likely that a governor will have, a Congress of the same party. And so if there is a majority opinion that emerges, it's more possible that things will happen both on the executive side and on the part of the legislature, and in some cases on both sides. So, not to be critical of the federal outcomes, but there's been a huge amount of discussion. I subscribe to various services, and barely a day goes by without some thoughtful, even profound statement from one or another, trade association, lobbyist, congressional committee, working group. This is all great, but the actions that are concrete and have been accomplished are quite few. And what this means is that, in a sense, my presentation may have more immediate relevance to you than just background while you watch what the federal government does. Next slide, please. Let's talk about what we're going to do. I don't know the relative level of knowledge of those in such a large group. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about key definitions and some governance principles. And then I'm going to talk about the procurement process and how AI affects it. I've been talking about the complexities of procurement as it has evolved over a period of years. I put together kind of a graphic slide about the forces and factors as to what makes it harder. And for a while, I was troubled by cloud procurement. For a while, I was concerned with the transition from, supplies to services, and then from services to solutions, and then from where you, procure the data processing solution to where you essentially manage the acquisition of an IT solution. Those all have been fairly profound, as all of you know. Well, AI is all of that and probably then some, and it's different. And it is complicated. One state, Maine, I think, passed has a state governor's edict that says we should take a moratorium on this for 6 months. It's tempting because this thing is just moving so fast. But if you take that attitude now, some opportunities will pass you by, and getting the foundation to kind of deal with AI sensibly and productively may be even more difficult to accomplish if you wait. I don't think that you want to jump in too rapidly. You must be wary of the many promises that any and all vendors will promote. In my day job as a lawyer for corporations, I represent a lot of companies, most of them in aerospace and defense, but also in IT and cloud computing. And, this is the flavor of, the hour, the day, the week, the month, and the year. And I can't seem to find my way around, offerings on even Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, or the latest and greatest, algorithm-driven, now renamed AI solution. You will get that all the time from many people. But not all resources are the same. Not all are trustworthy. You should assume in looking at these offerings that you do need to know more, and that trustworthiness is something that's required, and that it's the obligation of the vendor to establish. So we're going to talk also about some of those federal initiatives, even though we haven't seen legislation and many of the things in the AI executive order remain to be achieved. There's a general consensus that there's some smart stuff in the federal actions, and I'll talk about a few of those things which are highly relevant for states to consider. And then in what is essentially a new section for this program, I'm going to talk about strategies and actions for states to consider as you think about the policies and process, which will be new because this is kind of a new area of risk, and as you rework procurement to accommodate AI services and risks. This is really not just a couple of new clauses or an addendum. It's probably going to take a more systematic effort, and certainly one that is cross-functional among different state agencies, to have a procurement process that works for many entities within a state that may use AI, as well as one that satisfies the risk concerns of a CIO, the technology objectives of a CTO, the state business objectives of a chief business officer, and the like. This is all work, may require new positions, may require new resources. Staffing is hard to get, but it's going to be needed. I'll spend a little bit of time on a new due diligence. This is a subject I've talked about at a number of conferences. It used to be that we would show up at the contract signing, and the due diligence would be limited largely to what a vendor offered in its proposal and what past performance information we could obtain from state collected records. Well, now there are tools for supply chain illumination that can enable a state to know a great deal more about not only the prime contract offeror, but also those in its supply chain. And that level of knowledge sort of equalizes what both the buyer and seller know going into a contract. And I think it's important to think that due diligence and information sharing and analysis ought to not conclude at a point the contract is awarded, but extend past contract award and through performance. These are going to be hard things to make AI work successfully without harm for many state and local purposes. But I like the idea of having some mutuality in information and risk as a way to do that. Let's go to the next slide. As I see someone has received an AI-generated proposal, it is true. There's increasing opportunities to use AI to generate proposals, to generate RFPs. In theory, you could take all the proposals and you could ask a large language model to essentially compare the proposals and then summarize the differences. And you could, in theory, even ask the large language model to tell you what it likes. It could say, okay, my 4 objectives for this procurement are 1, 2, 3, and 4. Considering those 4 objectives, here are 4 proposals. Tell me what you like and why. Now, this gets a little bit hazardous because bid protest laws generally assume that there will be, human participation and the application of judgment and discretion, especially in such areas as a best value determination. And this is just a simple example of where we will find real benefits to the use of AI to summarize sizable volumes of data at speeds that just cannot be touched even by your best analyst. But we have to know kind of how far it goes, where it can be trusted, and when the human needs to not just be watching the loop, but in the loop to make the decisions. We also have to recognize that AI presents lots of opportunity for some contractually and some loss of opportunity for others. And unfortunately, I have to admit to being a lawyer in my day job. And what that means is that I can anticipate that there will be people who don't like the outcome of an AI informed procurement process as to them, and they will find means to challenge it. And some of those people may simply say it's unfair under the procurement laws of a particular state, or they may raise more aggressive concerns, such as suggesting that due process rights are challenged. Don't know. Lawyers are definitely part of the process. Although there are many other resources within a state who need to contribute to the utilization of AI, I wouldn't keep lawyers too far from the development of state policies and procedures. But I want to emphasize that if we went to a given state and we picked 4 or 5 entities, CTO, CIO, CISO, Chief Enterprise Officer, Chief Risk Officer, we took all of those, we probably find that very few today have the training that's necessary to really understand the stuff that we'll be talking about. And so for all levels of state government, training is important. And this California general, what are they called again? General AI guidelines actually quite good in distinguishing categories of training, so it's worth looking at. Okay, so a foundation model is kind of when we started hearing about AI and some of the big, powerful supercomputer-based models like GPT-4 or OpenAI. These are foundation models, and these are said to have staggering amounts of power, and they can predict the weather and help plan for fusion reactions and control, anticipate the flow of tides and the like. Well, those aren't really going to be what you are affected by much. And those are also likely to be controlled by a handful of very large vendors. They will make those resources available in proportion to a much larger group of vendor who will be offering you things that are either generative or in the nature of a large language model. Now, as I mentioned, these distinctions are not quite as firm as the use of box definitions would suggest in this slide. I think of generative AI as something that will depict something, images, audio, video, text. I know that examples are DAL-E, which Microsoft promotes as something that could make a picture of your pet, on a surfboard. Large language models are where you can put a lot of stuff in information in order to train the model. You want to be careful that you have a right to do so and not just harvest things that you don't own or that could subject you to a third-party infringement claim. But these are things where you could, in theory, provide a book by Proust to a large language model and ask it to write a 10-page term paper for you, and it probably would do it pretty well. I don't think we'll have time to get into how it's done, but the short version is that the large language model looks to an enormous universe of information about the particular subject, that is the focus of your inquiry. It then distills your question into a number of sort of itemized sub-questions, and then essentially looks across this vast universe to decide, to find, and then to assess, how the sources of information in the large language model have responded to the same or similar questions. And then, in a sense, it curates those and then writes up the results into a form it thinks you will anticipate. It can be done extremely well and at ridiculous speed. Many of you have already seen, do the large language model require sources to adhere to a specific format? Not necessarily. The more sophisticated large language models are more or less format indifferent, and sometimes they are language indifferent. There is a risk that large language models can sweep in information that people don't want them to have. You, as the custodian of state information, which includes the sensitive information of individuals and about state government, you want to be very careful that those who offer to use large language models for state purposes are not making improper use of your data. Do not retain rights to it. Do not allow the results of your data to be shared in any form with any customer other than you. And these things are, obvious to you, but I live some of the time, north of San Francisco, and I have seen this, let's call it an attitude on the part of VCs and startups that are doing AI, that whatever they can promote, sell successfully, and gain revenue from, they are all too likely to want to get that income faster than they will protect against the kinds of hazards which you have an obligation to, in fact, recognize and protect against. So you got to be careful. Now, there are some very powerful examples becoming readily available commercially of large language models. Those of you who use Office 365 may have seen Copilot. Google has Gemini, which has gone through a number of name changes and has a couple of steps of variation that I don't understand. And there's a new one that's independent that I think is built in part on Microsoft Azure, perhaps on AWS, called Perplexity. It's quite impressive. If you have a minute and want to look at things for yourself, it's well worth doing. Let's go to the next slide. So, on the left, we have a couple of quotes from a really important document. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is a unit of the Department of Commerce. It doesn't have any regulatory or contracting authority as such. But for a couple of decades, it's been the repository of very smart people who have the job of coming up with standards and best practices. It's responsible for some of the federal risk management framework documents that are the basis for federal approval of information systems. It's responsible for the security techniques that are used to validate cloud computing for the federal government. And it came up about 6 months ago with an AI risk management framework. This has been widely praised, and it too seeks to kind of strike a balance that is basically suggested by the text that I've highlighted in the left box. Once again, we see that AI has the significant potential to transform society from commerce and health to transportation and cybersecurity. Wow. And yet in the very next paragraph, it says that there are risks that negatively impact individuals, groups, organizations, communities, societies, the environment, and in case that wasn't enough, the planet. So what the AI RMF is trying to do is to set up, processes, policies, gates, and guidelines so that those who develop AI, as well as public sector acquirers of AI, are able to employ this risk management framework, to put it colloquially, so that you know what you're getting, that you understand and have mitigated the risks of what you're getting, and so that you can deploy it with those risks understood and mitigated. It's also well worthwhile. Is it presently required by the federal government for anything? Not to my example. Now, I just went to a recent site from Deloitte, which is obviously a marketer as well as a consulting firm, just to pick a few examples of use cases. And use cases are a huge thing, because many of you will have heard this, that, and the next thing about the endless promise of AI, but not be completely sure, well, just what could it do for me? And which version of AI would I be employing to get there? Well, I've tried to do a quick kind of catalog of those things. If you set up a chatbot with residents who are making inquiries about their entitlement to benefits, it may include both a large language model and generative AI to produce the chatbot. If you're looking to survey how 50 states look at a particular policy issue in order to assess what you should do in light of the laws and regulations of your state, that's more likely to be a large language model. if you're trying to do something that's really big data and to look at a decade of history of wildfires to identify at-risk areas and suggest abatement strategies, that could well require one of those big foundation models, et cetera. So another thing about the California Gen AI document, which again, I've only looked at recently, it just came out, is it has a really good section on expected use cases. There may be somebody who does a better job, but it does a very good one, so it's worth looking at. Next slide, please. I've got to pick up the pace here because I have too much to cover. So how and where may AI affect public sector procurement? Let's go to the next slide. So I've been iterating this slide for years, and at one time I said, "Damn, because we're making this transition from supplies to services to solution, the needs of the state are going up. The dollars are going down sometime, and they're going up other times. Our knowledge as state procurement officials of what vendors can do and what we can do seems to be better in some areas, worse in others, and a draw in other places. But frankly, as you look at all these things, each one of these symbols has something that has been introduced to the challenge of state procurement over the last, say, 7 to 10 years. And every one of them essentially adds to the complication of where we started. There's an awful lot of stuff to do and to worry about and to know about and to be at least informed about and to be able to buy intelligently even before you get to the column over on the right, which is AI. AI adds all those new concerns, and the core ones are really important: safety, fairness, security, resilience, transparency, and accuracy. But, and trust is essential. Don't give it away. Make them prove it. But it also provides all these new opportunities: speed, responsiveness, cost reduction, process automation, enhanced services, and operating efficiencies. And if you could get those 6 things, think about the range of change that you get just from the internal operations of state departments and agencies. Or think about the value of change that you could affect in the way that your state government interacts with its citizens. All of these things are true at once. And that's the hard part. And on the bottom, it says artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning. Well, I should have put it in the other order because machine learning has been out there for a while. Algorithms are not new. Deep learning is just sort of mining big data. The difference is that big data tends to be kind of in a silo for a particular thing, whereas AI can consolidate the silos or just ignore them and look at every form of information available to it and essentially come up with insight that is well beyond in breadth or sophistication what you could do through deep learning or machine learning. And then when combined with generative AI, can produce the output in terms of memos, recommendations, bullet points, charts, and chatbot answers to questions. It can produce things that machine learning and deep learning just didn't do. And it's here now and real. Well, let's not forget that privacy thing, because AI isn't paying a lot of attention to the privacy interest of citizens or to state privacy laws and regulations unless you make sure that it does and your vendor, in fact, is able to do so and not just say that they will. Next slide, please. So, I've made a point of tracking the NASPO objectives over a period of years. And here again, I want to start on the right side. This is artificial intelligence, states leading the way, NASPO. I think it's from this year. And it's a paraphrase or rephrase of what I showed you a moment ago from NIST. It essentially says, wow, this has tremendous impact on how citizens interact with government at all levels. And it recognizes that states are not waiting for federal action. And it says, well, states are getting going here and they're getting input from numerous stakeholders, all good. But this is really at a pretty small scale, considering the enormous range of things that can be done with AI. Now, if we look at the evolution from 2020 to 2023 in the top CIO priorities, there's some shuffling and, movement among the top 10. But the point that I will make here is this, that there are probably AI solutions available now or that will be offered and available soon that will affect all 10 of those priorities. Customer relationship management is easy. If AI can essentially do the vetting of different categories of your customers for state benefits, give you predictions as to who is more reliable or not, that are trustworthy and fair and equitable, and that don't work against the interest of historically disadvantaged communities, Well, I mean, you can do a huge amount with AI to accelerate, expedite, and improve the results for customer management. AI has very important significance for cloud services, first, in that it's usually the product of an application hosted in the cloud. And second, because it can really help you with a variety of sophisticated cybersecurity techniques. AI definitely can improve identity and access management by allowing you to use massive volumes of data in real time to look for patterns of discrepancy or nonconformity. And AI can be used in similar ways to help you be sure that the people have the privilege for just enough of their use of your state system for the time that they need to use it. And obviously, AI is not really a legacy function. So to the extent that you can make AI work for your state government, you will modernize it. Oh, yes, and workforce. This is one of the biggest things. There are some states, and California in particularly, I had not seen the 2024 NASPO state CIO. I have failed. I am sorry. Nelson, I apologize. You have corrected me. We will close the program now, and I will redo the slides. Okay, no, we'll keep going. So, one of the things that we have to appreciate is that, if people were worried about the transformation to cloud, moving from, bricks and mortar data centers to cloud or outsourcing, if people were worried about becoming managers of solutions rather than acquirers of developed solutions, if there was, change management to address for the workforce with these earlier step changes in technology, well, AI is kind of another thing altogether. It won't start that way because almost all of you are going to be pretty careful and limited in what you're willing to let these tools do. But it will have near-term and certainly mid-term and long-term effects on what the workforce does and how well the workforce likes their job, on workforce retention, on what training and skills are needed for the workforce, and on job satisfaction. But these things will not solve themselves. They will take a great deal of planning and effort to make sure that the workforce doesn't become a source of resistance to AI. Because as we all know, that within state governments, there are some changes that are not welcome. Even if they are a great idea, they are still unwelcome because they are a change to what is known and accepted. Next slide, please. So the acquisition process, I've been using this kind of funnel since I've been helping to teach state and local procurement at GW Law School for quite a while. The simple version was a then thing. I said, well, acquisition's not that hard. Through the acquisition process, the state kind of decides who the bidders are, what the requirements are. It articulates an evaluation mechanism. The acquisition asks the vendor community a question: can you fulfill my needs? The vendors make their proposals of their answers, and then the selection and award process produces a contract. Well, I just put together on the right a short list of some of the many ways in which AI actually tweaks or changes this simple funnel. We're going to have new sources of supply. We're going to have evolved requirements to reflect AI tools. They aren't the same. AI solutions don't stand still. We used to buy things through the waterfall where we'd have some, elaborate mechanism of deliverables until we accepted the solution. We've been stepping along the way to agile solutions, but this is even more so. You all see now how quickly AI is changing in the commercial world. That's going to happen to you too. Don't think you can slow it down. And so we need to be thinking about how an acquisition process deals with iterative solutions and how to make agile deployment, work with sufficient state oversight and authorization. Also, we have to be really careful about data and system security. I may not have time to get to it much later, but as you start to rely more upon AI, and as AI itself depends upon a computing stack that may distill to a small number of sources that have the necessary computing capability, these things become targets for nation-state adversaries, as well as ransomware attackers. And we can't go a day without some vivid and painful reminder that nothing that a state does in the area of infrastructure that you oversee or in the area of services that you provide, nothing is immune from exploitation, attack or disruption by adverse parties who are both persistent and skillful. And so although I haven't given it quite enough emphasis in these slides, I can't speak enough to the importance of having in mind at all times that earlier proposition: don't trust anyone, or if you do, trust them only as much as you need to, and make sure that trust is earned and retained, and look at means to monitor and to continuously assure that the system is working as expected, that the vendor is performing, without security exposure, that the supply chain remains secure. Next slide. All right, we'll go through the federal level stuff quite quickly. So the executive order, it's got all kinds of amazing things. I mean, it's a prodigious event. It's got a big strategy and a practice and a big landscape, and it wants to encourage leadership in AI development while protecting the rights and equities of citizens. It affects just 50 federal departments and agencies and has more than 100 assignments to individual and coordinated federal bodies. It's got a very aggressive schedule of actions, and in fact, the federal government has been making some progress in doing those things. Pretty impressive. However, executive authority, as implemented through an executive order, only goes so far. It would be nice if we had national privacy legislation, as is kind of needed at the core of effective AI, of a federal AI policy. We still don't have one. And you need money. I mean, to really get this done, you need a lot of money. I looked at the new federal fiscal 25 budget, and it has $3 billion for federal agencies to use AI, which is pretty generous, but just $197 million to advance the specific purposes of the EO. In the great scale of things, that's not nothing, but it's a lot closer to nothing than a lot. We also have to recognize that a change of administration could happen. And this is the kind of big scope EO that could be rescinded. And we have to appreciate that the administration took a course, a kind of balanced, kind of walk the tightrope approach. We want to remain the international leader for AI, as we should. We are the best as a nation at AI than any other country, China included. We want to continue that. We want to be the first to use it for infrastructure and for national security purposes. We want our lead to get bigger and stronger, and we like our public sector to benefit from it, while at the same time somehow protecting against the many, the list of known and the potentially unknown hazards that are present. Not easy and not cheap, and something that requires a lot of skilled people who really aren't there today. And this is quite different than the approach that the European Union has taken. Our approach is one of regulatory restraint and sectoral delegation to all of those three-letter agencies, FTC, FCC, SEC, whatnot. That could work, but the EU basically has this parliament, and they've said here are dozens of pages of rules that everybody has to follow. Now, I'm not necessarily praising what the EU does. It does at least show you kind of what you have to do if you're an AI provider in Europe. But here's an interesting point. The EU really doesn't have assets of the capability of the United States AI providers. So, there's a theory about the EU approach that it's essentially protecting what European AI providers exist at the attempt to exclude or frustrate the American leaders in the field. Of course, there are many things I like about GDPR, but it's a bit of a challenge for U.S. companies who happen to do some work for European people or in Europe. And we may have some of the same challenges from the EU AI law. Next slide, please. So I also want to mention OMB's implementation guidance, which is an incredible document. I won't have much time to go through it here. But if you look at that table on the right, the consolidated table of action, you're going to see that there's just a long list of things that agencies are supposed to do in different times, some of them quite soon. And those are all instructive or relevant to states. And in fact, when I was looking through some of the recent material, I found that some of our states have done the same thing. Oklahoma requires an AI expert for each agency. I think California does too. New Jersey requires agencies to develop AI policies. Other states do as well. Pennsylvania requires the establishment of core values. So it's worth looking at the executive order, definitely. And it's long, but it's definitely worth looking at. It's worth looking at the OMB guidance because there's a lot of thought that went into these things. and they may form good guidance for you at the state level to act, even if the federal government cannot kind of close the books on its particular objectives or, make hard decisions. One of the key points that is important in the OMB guidance and important to states is that we got to be thinking about transparency. Those who are affected by AI need to know it. Those who are buying it need to know what they're buying. And we want to make sure that the performance is improved. It doesn't just create risks for the people who are affected. We also want to make sure that AI acquisition is competitive and doesn't become captured by those, mega scale providers. We want to protect data, because state data is not data that belongs to or should be exploited privately by the AI vendor. We'll see what happens with the OMB guidance. The comment period just closed. Getting it all implemented in time will be hard. Next slide, please. So parallel practices, I'm just going to touch on this very quickly. Section 10 of the EO concerns advancing federal use of AI. And there's a list of about eight measures: external testing of AI, testing and safeguards, watermarking of generative AI, independent evaluation of vendors' claims. Those are things to consider, because there's no reason that your procurement of AI is immune from the same kinds of concerns. And that's just reinforcing my point that, there's a lot to learn here as you figure out how to manage AI and how to procure AI and manage the performance of AI resources in the OMB guidance. We are waiting for the terms of service from AI, and those will be important, because if they've already done good work, we should learn from it. Next slide. Now, interestingly and somewhat surprisingly, although there's a lot to learn from the EO about what states should do, there's very little in the EO about what the federal government should do with states. I'll leave it at that. It's described on the left column. And that does compare not so favorably with how NASPO looked at its federal advocacy priorities. NASPO correctly recognized that Congress and federal agencies should work closely with states as they continue to develop AI legislation and regulations, and that the federal government should provide tools and resources to state to implement AI strategies. The federal government has a lot to invest here. It actually knows a lot. It will probably have gone further and faster in some respects for AI deployment. $3 billion to be spent in the next fiscal year is a fair amount, and it would be great if states can get the benefit of that. The problem has been that for all of the talk and the many issuances of guidance and instructions and the AI Bill of Rights and the AI Risk Management Framework, these things are out there somewhere between, the ether of great ideas and the ground of things, being accomplished. And that's why states have not been waiting, but you still can be informed as you decide how to act yourself. Next slide, please. State strategies and actions. Next slide. So what are the key considerations? I don't think any of this will surprise you. I've already said that we don't have a unified federal AI, and I'm not really waiting for one. So states and localities have acted unilaterally. Now, there are some key objectives that are pretty obvious and widely agreed upon. You want your AI usage to be safe, trustworthy, and secure. But then there are a lot of questions as to, let's call them, implementation philosophy. Do we want to promote AI for our state, which California wants to do? Do we want to limit it because we don't know enough and are more concerned about the risk than we are attracted by the benefits? Several states. Do we want to delay it because we just don't want the thing anywhere near us, which I think is what Maine has done? And there are quite a few states who have really done nothing, which is another form of limitation and delay. Now, you probably can't answer this across the board, really, because there will emerge some services where the risks are relatively low and the benefits are pretty clearly high, and the legal exposure is modest and the citizen opportunities are good. So you're likely to find that you'll be making service by service decisions, but then you're going to need to kind of update, revise, revamp your procurement process, because you really can't take those legacy forms and process and procedure contract documents and apply it to AI. You're not really buying the same stuff. And then another question not resolved commonly among the states is, should the initiatives be strict? You can only do it my way, or you can't sell the stuff, or permissive? And if they're permissive, then they may be risk informed. Well, I want to look at whether the AI solution you provide me actually is highly impactful upon the citizenry or our state infrastructure, in which case I'm going to be much stricter and have more rules. Or I'm going to consider whether this is a limited use for internal purposes only with a modest consequence to my citizens, in which case I might be much more permissive and accommodating of a more rapid implementation with fewer contractual controls. Another big question is just who's going to make the decisions within the state? Do you try to centralize AI decision making within a state? Do you create essentially a chief AI officer? Do you pick a couple of your state agencies or departments and essentially turn them into a task force that will manage, which will manage the adoption of AI and its oversight for all departments and agencies? Or do you delegate these things across departments? The big issue on the federal side as well. In fact, the federal side, for all of the words of the executive order, has an awful lot of delegation to individual departments, which is not an outcome that produces great consistency. So I did put some resources down here. There are just 8 states as of the December 6th who have adopted executive orders on AI. Someone will correct me and say that there are no more now. Well, this is what I knew then or found now. I did here show you this State of California General AI Guidelines, which follows an executive order that was issued last fall. This is useful stuff to read also. I mentioned that there's a couple of states, at least Oregon and Texas, that have mandated only the creation of a task force. That's not wrong because this stuff's pretty complicated. And there's another state, Pennsylvania, that says, I want to set forth our core values and then require policies and procedures. The problem with some of the latter approaches is that it sort of assumes you have time to decide and that you will take the time that is needed to wade through this step-by-step careful process. AI is going to be on top of you for that unknown or incidental usage by your vendors. And you may well find that there are things that you would really like to do or need to do faster. And so part of the challenge is to make this thing go promptly, while not foregoing your respect for citizen interest, transparency, good governance, and the like. It's true here as well as at the state level. There are only so many AI sources, but the way things are shaping up, they're going to have to offer things that are a little different and sometimes a lot different for individual states or for federal departments and agencies. That's a complication. Next slide, please. So, should you wait for federal action? No, you should not. This was a slide I used in November with some updating. Basically then, which was just after the EO came out, I thought, wow, the EO is really impressive, and should I tell the state procurement lawyers that they should just wait until the federal government leads? I said, don't. I said you should watch, study, coordinate, prioritize, act, adjust, and accommodate. And that's still my advice, only more so because the federal government doesn't seem to be able to take the decisive actions which will make the federal strategies and methods, both instructive and real. However, there are acts that each state should do. And one of the key ones is on, say, the 5th bullet. Each state has its own legal authorities, existing policies, procedures, and regulations. Those will affect how you buy and who you can buy from and how you establish liability regimes and what those things will govern kind of what you can do now. You may find that you need some legislative changes to buy AI and to protect yourself against it at the same time. You may find that there are existing policies and procedures and regulations that can accommodate AI, but you should appreciate how that is done. You shouldn't leave it to chance or guess. And there may be areas, California found some, where you're going to need to add some policies and procedures to your procurement process. And you want to make sure, of course, that they conform to the overarching state law. I do have to finish my content. Okay, I am being lectured by NASPO Zoom. I didn't know who that is. Next slide, please. I'm going to go very quickly. All right, state by state legislation. This is from BCLP law. If you go to this link, you can see all the legislative activity, and there is a lot. According to one source, there were 440% more AI-related bills in 2023 compared to 2022. Let's go to the next slide. Novel procurement issues. This is one you should look at even if I don't have enough time to discuss it. Overarching themes are the ones I've discussed. There are a number of key deployment and operational considerations: data quality and governance, integration and interoperability. Don't buy AI if it isn't going to connect well to its existing legacy friends and family within state government. Resource constraints means, do you have people that know how to do it and can manage it? Change management and resistance is crucial. You will not be buying the same way to get to Kansas as you did when there were only trains from your state to Kansas. This is going to be a different way to get there, and you have to anticipate, what the transition is from the current state to the as sought state. You have to have an ethical and regulatory approach. You have to have data and solution security, and you have to be sure that your supply chain is trustworthy. Yes, we would like to have a comprehensive and strategic approach to AI adoption. Of course, we would, but that's a big task. And an incremental and iterative path is likely to be the choice that many of you will follow for adoption, because there's just too much to deal with all at once. Let's see if we have one more slide, and then I think I'm about done. Yeah, well, this you can read on your own. It basically says use high volume data to do due diligence for purchasing and keep yourself and your supplier informed of risks throughout the whole performance. Next slide and last slide. Parting thoughts. You need core state policies. It all begins with policies. What are you trying to do? What are the core objectives? What are the key benefits that you want? What is the sufficiency of the process? And I want to emphasize this, especially for the group on this call. Contracts are critical because, for all you talk about AI, very few states are going to be able to do it themselves. And so you're going to be using contracts to buy things for purely internal purposes of an individual department, and things for broad significance to externally, for those who receive forms of benefits or health care. And that means you got a lot of work to do, because it's just not buying the same stuff using the same tools. It really is different. And of course, you want to make sure that you're maintaining competition among qualified and trustworthy sources. I think that is all. Thank you for your patience and persistence. I hope this has been worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Bob. I can't say enough about that content. It was comprehensive, and you got through all of it in an hour, which is also really impressive. So thank you so much. And I think we've had great participation today, lots of comments in the chat. We won't have time for Bob to take questions today, but if you have some comments or questions for some future content with Bob, please send that to us in an email. I'll put my email back in the chat. We also wanted to say that we have an upcoming webinar on May 22nd, 2024 at 3 p.m. Eastern. This is procurement under FEMA awards. So we will be discussing the basic requirements for recipients and subrecipients when purchasing under FEMA awards, key considerations for contracting during emergency and exigent circumstances. So that should be a very informative webinar coming up. Bob, again, cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for your insight and your thoughtful review, and for taking what you know and applying it to what our members do every day. It really means a lot to us.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day, and that we've unveiled the secret behind some of that technological magic, and that you have some guidelines and discussion points at the very least to take back to your staff and your leadership. So thank you all so much.